You good? How you doing? You're very, very welcome to Tras na Tíre tonight. Tonight we're going to be looking at the Robinstown affair, a War of Independence story by Jim O'Leary. Jim O'Leary has published a book on the Robinstown affair, and it looks at one of the lesser known stories from County Meath. And when I say lesser known, I don't really mean it. I think every county has got a really important story to tell. Jim, you are more than welcome tonight to Tras na Tíre.
Thank you very much. Do I start now?
Yeah, away you go.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you very much to Liam and the broader Tras na Tíre community for this opportunity to speak to you about the Robinstown affair. All the more so since there are a few copies of the book left. And it'd be nice to get them sold and move on maybe to a second print run. Anyway, let me start with an overview of my remarks, which will probably go on for about 35 or 40 minutes. And if I drift beyond that, Marcus, stop me.
You take your time, there's no problem at all. We've all the time to work with.
Okay. So the ground I'm going to cover is laid out here. I'll say a few introductory remarks about the War of Independence in Meath. I'll go on then to make a few observations about the company of Auxiliaries that was posted to Trim in County Meath in February 1921. Then I'll say a few things about the family that was at the center of the story. The family that were the victims of the raids that took place on Ash Wednesday, 1921, the Chandler family. I'll describe the raids themselves briefly. I'll spend some time then looking at the aftermath of the raids, by which I mean, what happened in terms of disciplinary action, the resignations that were prompted, the controversy then that developed, because the Robinstown affair became something of a political cause célèbre, and we want to explore the reasons for that, because it's not necessarily obvious why it happened as it did. There's a couple of key questions then that I want to zone in on, having, if you like, gone through the narrative. One of them is, why were the Chandlers targeted in the first instance? And the other, because they were improbable targets for a variety of reasons, which I'll come to in a while. And the second key question is, given that what happened in Robinstown was almost innocuous by the standards of behavior that the Auxiliaries had shown themselves capable of, why did it develop into the controversy that it did, right? And then to conclude, I will draw some lessons from the foregoing, lessons for, I suppose, principally for historians. Okay, so start with a little bit of material on the war in Meath. Meath, I guess it's fair to say, was one of the quieter counties during the War of Independence. If you use fatalities as your index of activity, it was much quieter than the Munster counties, much quieter than Dublin, much quieter even than Longford. There were just 2 RIC men killed during the period 1919 to 21 in Meath, one soldier and 2 IRA volunteers. In fact, as other historians have pointed out, more people died in Meath because they were executed as informers by the IRA during the War of Independence than died in the course of action. That said, things happened in Meath. It wasn't entirely quiet. And a point has been made by some of the veterans of the War of Independence in Meath is that you don't judge activity or the success of Sinn Féin or the IRA in Meath with reference to violence alone. I mean, there were other things going on. Sinn Féin / IRA was running a parallel system of justice at the time. It was running a parallel system of local government. So it wasn't just about war. It was also, of course, about propaganda, and we'll come to that in a while. Anyway, the war in Meath, for all that it was quieter than in many other parts of the country, it took on a similar pattern. It started with attacks on RIC barracks, particularly those that were small and relatively remote. Another feature of the early phase of hostilities in Meath was the collection of arms from private homes, not necessarily a voluntary collection either, of course. I guess the single most important action that took place in Meath during the War of Independence occurred in September 1920, the 30th of September 1920 to be precise, and that was the capture of Trim Barracks. And that was a big operation because the barracks was big and the barracks had a big garrison. And it was a very good example of what the IRA at the time could do if they planned meticulously, as they did, if they were well organized, as they were for this, and if they kept stum about their plans, which was a problem with other plans. I make reference there in the slide to numerous aborted ambushes that were planned, attacks on army or police patrols that didn't take place because for one reason or another, the patrol in question varied its route that particular night. And in a lot of those circumstances, the suspicion had to be that information leaked in one way or another. Hence, back to the earlier point I made about the number of executions of informers that took place in the county. Early 1921, things heated up a bit in Meath. There were quite a number of ambushes that did take place, a couple of them in particular in Trim, one in Haggard Street, which resulted in the wounding of several Black and Tans and the death from his wounds of one of them a couple of days later. And also around that time, there was a concerted series of attacks on the transport and communications infrastructure throughout the county. And then on the 1st of February 1921, a company of auxiliaries was deployed to Trim. And the reason must have been that the authorities figured that the threat posed by the IRA in the county was sufficiently significant to warrant the reinforcement of the Crown forces within the county. And so a company of auxiliaries was deployed, N Company. A few remarks about N Company. It was formed in early January 1921. Most of the recruitment occurred through the middle 2 weeks of January. Most of the recruits were in their 20s. The average age was about 28. They were pretty well all ex-armed forces officers. By armed forces, I mean Army, Navy, or Air Force. Some of them came from Commonwealth armies. In terms of nationality, they were mostly British, by which I mean English, Scots, or Welsh. But there was a significant sprinkling of Irish in N Company. About 15 of the 95 were from Ireland, 4 from the north, 11 from what is now the Republic of Ireland, and amongst them a number of Catholics, 4 or 5 Catholics, one of whom went on to have a son called Well, the stage name, Dave Allen, right? So Dave Allen's father was a member of N Company stationed in Trim. He wasn't involved in the raids on Robinstown, on Chandlers and Robinstown, I should add. They came from a wide range of social backgrounds. I mean, the notion that they represented the dregs of British society is entirely wrong. They came from the full spectrum of the social circumstances. Some of them from very modest backgrounds, for sure, but some of them from very privileged backgrounds. Including the sons of doctors. There was at least 2 sons of clergymen. There were a couple of them that came from notably wealthy backgrounds. There was one guy who married into the Asquith family, Herbert Asquith, Liberal Prime Minister of Britain in the early 20th century. So the notion that they were, the sweepings of the streets is entirely misplaced. Another point to make about N Company is that they had seen, well, it's inevitable. They were only formed in early January. They only reached full strength towards the latter part of the month. So they had seen very little action before they were deployed to Meath. They were involved in a couple of raids in Dublin, it's true. One of them, the Barlow Terrace raid, Barlow Terrace being near Dunor Avenue, where because of an unfortunate misunderstanding, the people in the house, one of the houses that was raided, thought they were being raided by the IRA and fired through the door at what they presumed were their attackers, and the Auxiliaries returned fire and killed one of the people in the house, the wife of an army bandmaster, believe it or not, who was stationed in the barracks, the South Circular Road. So that's N Company. We go on then and ask the question, who were the Chandlers? Who were the Chandler family? Where did they come from? And so on. Well, they were a Protestant family, Church of Ireland, quite prosperous. They had very extensive land holdings in the Robinstown area, and they ran a grocery and pub business as well. They weren't long-standing natives of Robinstown. The paterfamilias, Richard Chandler, had arrived there in 1860 with his wife and 2 sons. He had come from Rathcore, an area in South Meath, close to Summerhill. So interestingly and tragically, the 1901 census lists 9 Chandlers in Robinstown, right, occupying 2 households that were located cheek by jowl with each other. But by 1921, there were just 3 Chandlers in the village. Frances Chandler, a widow, her son, Dick, who at that stage was 27 years of age, and a daughter, Irene. In the previous 2 decades, Frances Chandler had buried her father-in-law, her brother-in-law, her husband, who died at age 40, and 3 of her children. Quite a shocking incidence of early mortality, especially amongst her children. The other thing that's worth saying about the Chandlers is that these were by no means big house Protestants. These were people who were well integrated into the local community. So well integrated indeed that Dick, the son, played Gaelic football for Robinstown. An interesting fact, because one doesn't associate Gaelic football with Church of Ireland people, particularly at this time, because for many people in the early 20th century, membership of the GAA signified clearly where your political sympathies lay. And Dick Chandler played Gaelic football for Robinstown and seems to have played it to a reasonable standard, if reports of a couple of matches from around that time are anything to go by. Okay, so let's move on. The Ash Wednesday raids. Now, a couple of points about these raids that don't appear on the slide. One is that these raids took place on the 9th of February. N Company, the full complement of N Company, were only in trim since the 4th of February, right? So this is amongst the first actions taken by N Company, or a subset thereof. It is actually their first raid, right? They had been involved in a couple of other activities, such as trying to extinguish the fire at Summerhill House. And there was another incident at Ballivor a couple of days earlier, where one of the cadets, one of the auxiliary cadets, was shot in the legs. And I might come back to that when I have gone through my presentation, because let me just say, the publication of a book is something that acts as a kind of a magnet for information that one mightn't have had at the time of writing the book. And since publishing the book, I have received or come across fresh information, including information about this Ballivor incident that I didn't have when I was writing it. So I'll come back and mention that later. So that's the first point anyway I want to make, is that this is their first raid, right? The other point I want to make, well, the other points are covered here. It's a joint raid. So it includes not only auxiliaries, about 30 of them, but also some army people and some members of the regular RIC. And you might ask yourself the question, well, what purpose was served on a raid like this by the presence of regular RIC men? And from reading some of the testimony provided to the Bureau of Military History by former RIC members who were sympathetic to the Republican cause, one of the purposes, if not the main purpose, of an RIC presence on these raids was to ensure that the law was observed. Somewhat laughable when you consider what happened on the raids. I mean, if this was the purpose of the RIC presence, well, then the purpose was rarely served, including on this occasion, right? So the first raid occurred at lunchtime on Ash Wednesday. The raiding party had already that morning done extensive, if not exhaustive, house-to-house searches in Ardbraccan and in Bohermeen, which are districts not very far away from Robinstown, but not exactly contiguous to Robinstown either. And the purpose of making that point is to support the proposition that their arrival in Robinstown was not a mere continuation of the house-to-house search operation. Their arrival in Robinstown was due to the fact that they had targeted the Chandler premises. And the reasons for that I will come to later. So this wasn't random, right? This wasn't random. This was targeted. So 11 lorries transporting more than 40 personnel converged on the little crossroads of Robinstown at around 1:15, 1:30 on Ash Wednesday. And the auxiliaries then entered the property. And suffice it to say, there's no great need for purple prose here. They did a lot of damage. They engaged in very abusive behavior. They looted the place. They made off with a lot of stuff, food, drink, bedclothes, coins, what have you. And they found 12 rounds of ammunition in a drawer, right? And some observers have attributed their behavior to the fact that they discovered the ammunition and kind of went mad having discovered the ammunition. They kind of stepped the thing up several gears. Now, I don't think that, I think given the character of the auxiliaries, I don't think they needed to find 12 rounds of ammunition in order to behave the way they did. The kind of behavior they engaged in seems to have been the default setting for the auxiliaries at the time. Now, the other aspect of this is that having spent an hour and a half or 2 hours in place in the early afternoon, they went back to their barracks, and having arrested Dick Chandler as well, the son of the house, but they came back later that night. They came back at around 10 o'clock and essentially took up where they had left off earlier. This time it was just the auxiliaries. They were unaccompanied by army or regular RIC men. They, as I say, they took up where they left off. Another orgy of abusive behavior, destructive conduct, looting, this time probably fueled to a greater degree than previously by drink. There was a lot of drink consumed when they came back that night. Once again, they arrested Dick Chandler. He had been released after his earlier arrest, and they arrested him during the nighttime raid as well. Okay. What happened in the aftermath of the raids? Well, 2 members of N Company went to a hospital in Dublin to visit an injured colleague. I suspect it was the cadet who was shot on the outskirts of Ballivor a few days earlier. While they were there, they met General Tudor, who was the chief of police, and they told General Tudor what had happened at Robinstown. And Tudor told them, ordered them indeed, to go and visit General Crozier, the commandant, the overall commander for Ireland of the auxiliaries, and report their story to him, which they did. Crozier acted almost instantly. He came out to Trim the following day. He spent several hours investigating what had happened, trying to get to the bottom of it. And the outcome of his investigation was that he placed the 5 auxiliaries whom he identified as ringleaders, he placed them under arrest. And he then dismissed 26 others, right? Now, his boss, Tudor, the chief of police, approved the first part of the disciplinary action. He never had any difficulty with the fact that the 5 ringleaders were arrested, but he did have a difficulty with the 26 dismissals, and that difficulty undoubtedly was reinforced by conversations he had with Sir Hamer Greenwood, who was the Secretary for Ireland. Shortly after Crozier returned to Dublin after his investigation, Tudor went to London to speak to, amongst others, Hamer Greenwood. And after that visit, when he returned to Dublin, he effectively overturned or countermanded Crozier's dismissals of the 26. Crozier then resigns. and in his letter of resignation, he says that he can't remain a member of a group that or a police force that condones looting and robbery. He resigns, and then the affair makes it to the newspaper headlines and becomes a matter, subject matter for House of Commons exchanges on several occasions over the next couple of weeks. There is actually speculation at one stage that the way in which the Irish administration is handling the fallout from this affair is causing acute difficulties for the government and might actually bring the government down, might bring the tensions between the coalition parties, the Liberals and the Tories, might bring those tensions to a head and bring the government down. And in fact, at around this time, the government loses a sequence of by-elections to the Labour Party, which of course has been very critical of the government's policy on Ireland and the government's handling of the aftermath of the Robinstown affair and Crozier's resignation and the countermanding of his disciplinary actions and so on. The net result of all this, from the point of view of the miscreants, of the guys who were responsible for what happened in Robinstown, is that there's a military inquiry, and that military inquiry puts forward a number of cadets, a number of members of N Company for court-martial, 18 of them, in fact. The 5 ringleaders, 6 of the 26 that Crozier had dismissed, and 7 others who were not part of Crozier's original, or were not objects of Crozier's original disciplinary action at all. So there's 2 court cases in June of 1921, one relating to the daytime raid, the lunchtime raid, one relating to the nighttime raid, and the net outcome of those courts-martial is that 8 auxiliaries are found guilty of larceny and conspiracy to rob, and they are sentenced to terms varying from 3 months to 6 months. Some of them don't serve more than a few weeks. So that's essentially the narrative arc. If we go on then to consider what I regard as 2 of the key questions, 2 of the fascinating questions raised by the whole affair. The first is, why was the Chandler premises targeted? These people were Protestants. Surely the fact of them being Protestant meant that they were loyal, they were unionist, and therefore posed no threat to the Crown forces or the government. This, of course, is a form of naive thinking. It's also reductive. The equation of Protestantism and unionism is not always correct, and I'll come back to that in a couple of moments. But the second question is, why did the Robinstown raids become such a big deal? I mean, there was nobody killed, there was nobody even injured. The premises wasn't burned. So, and by comparison with what the auxiliaries had shown themselves capable of doing, as I said before, what they did in Robinstown was almost innocuous. So why did it develop as it did? And another question is, what lessons may be drawn from the affair? Well, let me take those questions in turn. Why was the Chandler premises targeted? Well, number of considerations. One is that there had been some significant IRA activity not far from Robinstown over the previous few weeks. There was an attempted ambush, and one of these aborted ambushes at a place called Clady, which is only a mile from Robinstown. And had this ambush taken place, given the scale of the operation, given the number of IRA volunteers involved, given the explosives that they intended to use, it would, dare I say it, it would have blown the capture of Trim Barracks out of the water as an event of significance in the War of Independence in Meath. It didn't take place because the army patrol that were to be the victim, the objects of the ambush, they used a different route that night, which to me signifies that they knew about the ambush. They knew this thing was planned. They had got inside information and they took evasive action. But the fact of them knowing about it meant that the locality was a locale of interest now. Right? Who was behind this? What was going on? So the raid on Chandler's premises has to be seen in the context of that attempted or aborted ambush at Clady. And I put in Kilcooley there as well because there was a kind of repeat of the Clady thing, albeit on a much smaller scale, a couple of weeks later. Second consideration, Chandlers was a public house. And as a public house, it was a possible venue for meetings of IRA volunteers, Sinn Féin sympathizers, what have you, right? And as a possible meeting place for IRA volunteers, there was always the possibility that arms and or ammunition and or seditious literature would be hidden there, perhaps unbeknownst to the Chandlers, the owners. Then there's the Loughran connection. One of Francis Chandler's daughters, Mabel, married a Catholic. And that was unusual for the time because Church of Ireland people generally married each other. But what made it more than unusual was the fact that the Loughran family into which Mabel Chandler married was a family with strong Republican loyalties and credentials. She had a brother-in-law who was a very active member of the effective company of the IRA during the War of Independence and spent time in jail on that account. And he in turn had a first cousin who was a company commander in Navan, the Navan IRA, and also spent time in prison. So yes, the Loughran connection probably was known, if not to the Auxiliaries, who were only in the county a week or two, well, less than a week, certainly would have been known to the RIC and possibly to the army. And then finally, there's the fact that in his Bureau of Military History testimony, Eugene Bratton, who was a serving RIC constable at this time, he claimed that another constable had told him that he had planted ammunition in Chandler's because his wife and Francis Chandler had had a falling out. So as an act of revenge, he planted the 12 bullets in the premises knowing that a raid was taking place, or suspecting that a raid might take place, or perhaps using his knowledge that the ammunition was there to persuade people that this premises was one worthy of attention. So anyway, there's a number of considerations as to why the Chandler premises was targeted. Okay, so why did Robinstown become such a big deal? Part of the answer to this question resides in another question, which is, why did Crozier propose the sanctions that he did in response to what happened at Robinstown? Bearing in mind that by the standards of the Auxiliaries, this was not such a big deal. So why did Crozier punish M Company as he did? Why did he dismiss the 26 on top of putting the 5 ringleaders up for trial? And this was severe by his standards, because looking at his own memoirs, Crozier states that in a 3-month period from August through October of the previous year, he had dismissed a total of 50 men from the Auxiliaries. So in response to what happened in Robinstown, he was proposing to dismiss a number equivalent to half the total he had dismissed over a 3-month period in 1920. So I suspect, in fact, all the evidence points in this direction. I suspect that Crozier was, at this stage, very concerned about his reputation. Bearing in mind that the Auxiliaries had had a serious disciplinary problem from the outset, bearing in mind that Crozier was the person ultimately responsible for discipline, he must have felt that his reputation had been severely damaged over the previous number of months. And it was time, I reckon, in his estimation, to do something about this, to draw a line in the sand. You know, this was, if you will, the straw that broke the camel's back. It was time to signal to the Auxiliaries that he was now instituting a new regime when it came to discipline. So I suspect that provides the explanation for the apparent severity or even the disproportionality of what he was proposing to do by way of disciplinary action here. It may also have been part of his thinking that N Company has only just been formed. They've barely taken to the field, and they're behaving like this already. They didn't have, in respect of what they did at Robinstown, they didn't have the excuse that this was a reprisal. It wasn't a reprisal. They didn't have the excuse that they had been so long exposed to IRA terrorism, if you wish, that they were suffering from some form of traumatic stress disorder. These guys were fresh. So all of this goes to make their behavior from Robinstown all the more inexcusable. And it's likely that consideration also weighed on Crozier's mind when he decided what he was going to do. Now, having proposed the sanctions that he did, having had those sanctions countermanded, it was always open to him to go quietly. Why did he not go quietly? And again, I suspect that the reason he didn't go quietly was because he needed to restore his reputation. And his reputation could only be restored if he made public what was going on and what motivated him. If he had gone quietly, if he had resigned and said nothing about it, it's likely that wouldn't have done his reputation any good in his estimation. One also has a sense, though, that this was a man who relished the publicity that he received, a man who relished the fray, a man who relished orchestrating the media coverage of the affair. And he did orchestrate the media coverage of the affair. It is an object lesson in managing a story, how he behaved. His leaking of information, his leaking of letters, his judicious nurturing of contacts in Parliament, his interviews with the press. He had the government on the back foot from the get-go, right? It was his narrative that dominated the coverage of this story. And as I say, read from that point of view, the aftermath of the Robinstown affair is an object lesson in how to do publicity, right? And of course, the other reason why Robinstown became such a big deal is that is context. That the version of events that Crozier was putting on public record, was putting out there, was a version of events that resonated very strongly with the narrative that had emerged over the previous year, or certainly the previous 6 to 9 months, right? In other words, the Robinstown affair and its aftermath dropped like a lighted match into the kindling that was, you know, the misbehavior of the Auxiliaries, the atrocities that they had committed, the apparent ambiguity of the British government towards reprisals, and so on and so forth. So some of those points are covered here, and I won't repeat them all. So the context, the background against which Robinstown took place is the background summarized in these points here. And the last point there is, you know, by February 1921, quite a wide range of public and civil society organizations in Britain were united in their opposition to government policy on Ireland, united in their outrage at the methods being deployed by the Crown forces in Ireland, and particularly by the Auxiliaries, who had a terrible reputation. Some lessons. This is where, again, kind of pompous. The pitfalls of reductive thinking. Yes, and I return to a point I made earlier here, this equation of Protestantism and loyalism. And, you know, most historians who have touched on the Robinstown affair, and mostly it has just been touched on because it's not much more than a footnote in the overall scheme of things. But most of them are happy to accept that the Chandlers must have been loyal or unionist because they were Protestant. I did a fair amount of research on the family in the context of of the book, I found very little evidence of unionism. Yes, there's a couple of occasions when, kind of under pressure, Frances Chandler protests her loyalism and so on. But if you go back through what evidence there is, there's actually a few intriguing strands that suggest that at least some members of the family had some nationalist sympathies. I'll give you a few examples. Frances' brother, Robert Parsons, he was a supporter, at least insofar as he gave financial donations. He was a supporter of the Irish Parliamentary Party. I referred already to Dick Chandler and the fact that he had played Gaelic football for Robinstown. Another, perhaps the most intriguing strand of evidence relates to Dick Chandler's grandfather, Richard Chandler, the pater familias, the original mover from Rathcore to Robinstown, who died aged almost 100 in 1906, and whose death notice in the Drogheda Independent referred intriguingly to his proclivity to tell stories about the famine and tell stories about the heroics of the 1848 movement. And of course, the reference to 1848 is a reference to the Young Irelanders. And they were certainly not unionist or loyal in any way. They were very much Republicans in their thinking. And of course, some of the leading Young Irelanders were Protestants. You know, I mean, the reductive thinking to which I'm referring here kind of glosses over the fact that at every stage, be it 1798, be it 1848, be it you know, the 1916 Rising and the War of Independence, at every stage along the way, there were some Protestants who were prominently involved, right? The other point, which I've already made, I won't repeat, relates to the dregs of English society. A couple of other lessons. The importance of framing a story. You know, there are a number of ways in which this story might have been framed. You know, had the government got out of the box first here, had they been first to, if you like, frame the story or first to put the story out there in the media, you know, it might have been very different. It might have been a story about a totally justified raid on a premises where there was known IRA involvement or known sympathies with the truth or otherwise of it mightn't have mattered. But to put a story out there, to frame it like that at the outset, and thereby influence subsequent versions or subsequent repetitions of the story. But no, this story was framed from the very outset as an example of bad behavior by the Auxiliaries, and even worse behavior by the military authorities in countermanding, you know, thoroughly well-deserved disciplinary action. And of course, Crozier himself played a huge role in that. One or two other things, and I leave it at this. It's important to remember in thinking about and looking back on the War of Independence that the Crown forces were not monolithic. And this, I suppose, this remark particularly applies to the position of the regular RIC, in particular in what is now the 26 counties. Many of them well, most of them were Catholic. Many of them were nationalist. Many of them were sympathetic to the Republican cause. And even those who weren't had a different way about to the army, and certainly a very different way about them to the Auxiliaries and the Black and Tans. And that shows up in the Chandler story, because just to draw attention to something that's in the book but hasn't been part of my presentation so far, Dick Chandler was arrested. He ended up spending 5 nights in Mountjoy prison on a very serious charge. The charge was illegal possession of ammunition. And people were interned in Ballykinler and Spike Island for less than that. So he could very well have ended up with the same fate. But he got out. He was released. He was discharged after 5 days in Mountjoy. Why, we cannot be absolutely certain, but there is good reason to believe that he got out because of the intervention of a senior RIC officer. In fact, County Inspector Egan appears to have been the man who interceded on his behalf. And it's shown in another way, this non-monolithic nature of the Crown Forces. At the trials that took place in June, and indeed earlier, Frances Chandler made it very, very clear that her difficulty, her problem was with the Auxiliaries. It wasn't with the RIC. The RIC had always been her friends, right? And I suspect part of the reason for that was that, perhaps with one exception, namely William Martin, whose wife had fallen out with Frances Chandler, and who himself had it is claimed, had planted the ammunition in the pub. But with that exception, Frances Chandler may have had very good relations with the RIC in Robinstown. The RIC barracks in Robinstown was just across from the pub, and no doubt the proximity meant that there was a fair amount of toing and froing between them. And the last point I make about all of this is that the War of Independence was not all about fighting. It wasn't all about fatalities. It wasn't all about guns. There was a lot of other stuff going on as well. Constructive stuff, some of it, like the parallel justice system and local government system that Sinn Féin was operating. But also, the war was fought in the media. It was a propaganda war as much as anything else, and the value of propaganda was not lost on either side, and in particular was not lost on the Sinn Féin side. Garret Fitzgerald's father, Desmond Fitzgerald, played the role of Minister for Propaganda in the provisional government for some time, to be followed indeed by Erskine Childers, the father of the subsequent president of this state. Anyway, one last slide. That's it. I leave that one up.
Brilliant stuff, Jim. That was fantastic. You really got me enthralled into this, because I 100% agree with you about it being like a propaganda war the more you look into it. And I wanted to actually ask you, what was the Republican reaction to this? Did they take advantage in terms of propaganda of what happened in Robinstown?
The short answer is no.
Okay.
I have gone through the Irish Bulletin. The Irish Bulletin was the propaganda organ of the provisional government, the Sinn Féin government of the time. And interestingly, there is virtually no reference to Robinstown in that bulletin, right? So it seems to me that from a propaganda point of view, there was probably too much other stuff going on, right? If you like, there was lower hanging fruit than Robinstown, you know, that you could make, that you could render of propaganda value. So no, the simple answer is no.
Okay, no problem at all. Hilda Lochran is asking, was there any truth in the suggestion that Frances Chandler or her in-laws, the Parsons, had connections or influence in the British Parliament?
Well, there may be, but I haven't come across it.
No problem.
I haven't come across any suggestion of that. And here I kind of have to put up my hands and say that the fact of COVID restricted how much research I could do and how many archives I could go to. Now, I'm not sure that I would have found evidence of that, what Hilda is talking about, in any archives, but there's other areas here that I wasn't able to explore quite as deeply or rigorously as I would otherwise have done. I mean, I had intended this time last year to go to Kew, where the British National Archive is, to check out, you know, old War of Independence papers, particularly those pertaining to the RIC and the Auxiliaries. And I had to abandon that trip. And likewise, even the National Archive here, I couldn't visit. Anyway, that's a little bit off the point. Let me just say one other thing. There is a strand of thought that has it that the reason why Crozier got so upset about the whole thing and took the action he did is because there were representations made on behalf of the Chandler family to him. Okay. Now, again, I found no evidence of that. In fact, I'd be surprised if that were the case, because Crozier repeatedly referred to the Chandlers as a man called Charles, right? Okay. He, you know, at one stage in his, it may be a memoir, he talks about ordering the Auxiliaries to raid the farm of a man called Charles. And on subsequent occasions, he also refers to this Charles name. Now, that doesn't suggest to me a man who had representations made to him on the part of the Chandler family, but I may be wrong.
Okay. Noel McGlynn has said, Jim, did you know archaeologists found an old revolver in the River Boyne under the old Kilcairn Bridge at Navan pre-bridge strengthening works a few years ago? I understand it may date from the War of Independence or Civil War, or some IRA or anti-treaty man may have thrown it over the walls while being chased. Great talk. Must buy the book off you when I am in Navan, Trim, or Robinstown next. What was it? The one thing that you mentioned that kind of got my interest a lot was about Crozier, because I made a documentary on Bloody Sunday, and I know that Crozier was quite upset with some of his men, like the lower down men, in terms of how they reacted. And he kind of got overruled even in terms of disciplinary action that he gave some of his men. And it just seemed that it's like nearly 10 days after this happens, he resigns. Is that right? Or
yeah, this happened on the 9th. And his letter of resignation was written on the 19th.
Okay. So this is his hill that he's going to die on, like in terms of getting this story out. Okay. Yeah. Why do you think he did that? Like, why this story?
I think this was, well, I think this was the straw that broke the camel's back.
Yeah.
I think he'd had enough. I think his period as commandant of the Auxiliaries had been dogged from the get-go by disciplinary problems. I think he was becoming increasingly fearful of what damage this was all doing to his reputation. I think insofar as there might have been a trigger which signaled to him that this was the time, to take a stand. It might well have been a report that was published by the British Labour Party only a couple of weeks earlier. They had sent a commission of inquiry to Ireland to assess the situation here and to evaluate the role of the British government and the Crown forces. And the Labour Party Commission's report was fairly critical all round, but was scathing in relation to the auxiliaries and the auxiliaries' lack of discipline, and went so far as to question whether there was any command structure in place at all or not. Okay. Now, the little I know of Crozier would lead me to believe that that was a report that particularly stung him, right? Because this was personal now. He was the guy who was carrying the can, and he wasn't going to carry it anymore.
Okay. Somebody asked here, if it was a small non-event, when you had mentioned that before, why though the interest in Westminster? Like, why did it nearly bring down the government, as you'd mentioned?
Again, it's down to the notion of a tipping point, right? It's down to the notion of context. I mean, as I described in my talk, there had been growing outrage across British society, extending back over the previous 6 months. Outrage at the behaviour of the Crown forces in Ireland, the auxiliaries in particular. And there had been growing suspicion of and criticism of the government's apparent ambiguity and equivocation on the whole matter of discipline and atrocity. And I suppose in some ways, the aftermath of the Robinstown affair provided a particularly sharp illustration, or what was at least grasped as a particularly sharp illustration of that ambiguity. Because here you had, on the one hand, you had an apparently honorable and principled former soldier, commandant of the auxiliaries, taking stern but merited disciplinary action. And you had that being countermanded for political reasons by his superior.
Okay.
So, this, I suppose it crystallized the concerns it crystallized the concerns and outrage and disgust in a particularly clear way.
Okay. Patrick Kilfeather has asked, Jim has indicated that following the publication of your book, you received further information or detail concerning the raid. Does he consider that extra information significant that you're only made aware of post-publication?
Yes, it is significant, actually, and I don't mind. I don't mind revealing it, although I haven't fully processed it yet. But let me indicate. Let me contextualize it. Let me go back to an incident that occurred before the raids and the Robinstown raids themselves. A couple of days before, there was an incident outside Believer, right? Now, my information about that incident, as of the time I wrote the book, was derived from newspaper coverage, right? And the newspaper reports had it that the auxiliary concerned, whose name was Alan Leggett, that he was pursuing two suspicious characters on bicycles outside Believer. He shouted at them to stop, and one of them turned around and shot him in both legs. That is the story as recounted in more than one local newspaper report at the time. The piece of information that I have since that has since come into my possession actually has it that what happened was that Leggett was shot by one of his own comrades. And in order to justify an outbreak of reprisals and terrorising of the people around Ballivor, the version of events that was adopted by the Auxiliaries and that was put out there was that he was actually shot by suspected IRA.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, that's brilliant, actually.
Yeah. So the source of this information, I mentioned Desmond Fitzgerald earlier.
Yeah.
Desmond, the papers of Desmond and Mabel Fitzgerald, Mabel was his wife, they were given to the archive at UCD, as far back as 1993. So they're there nearly 30 years. I knew nothing of the existence of these papers until I Googled the Robinstown affair about a week ago. I've got into the practice of Googling the Robinstown affair now instead of my own name. And it's interesting to observe, what you get back. And mostly there's not much change from day to day. It's the same old stuff. But one day last week, a fresh little piece of stuff or a link came up when I Googled the Robinstown affair. And it was this link to the papers of Desmond and Mabel Fitzgerald. And this is a good news story, actually, because, Jesus, I became excited all of a sudden. And I decided to contact the UCD archive to see if I could get a copy of this transcript, because it's a 7-page transcript of an interview given by two of the members of N Company, a Carter and a McCartney, to Art O'Brien, who was a prominent Sinn Féin member in London, who would have been in regular contact with Desmond Fitzgerald. They gave him a 7-page, well, what amounted to a 7-page version of their experiences within N Company, what they observed, including their observations about Ballivor. And incidentally, these two guys, Carter and McCartney, were the two guys who went to visit their comrade in hospital. They were the two guys who were the whistleblowers. They supplied the story initially to Crozier. It was the fact of them telling Tudor and Crozier about what had happened that got Crozier out to trim.
Oh wow! Okay, all right. So we actually have the names of them now. That's brilliant, actually. Eddie Bohan has asked, it's a more general question, but how organized were the IRA in Meath? What was their numerical strength? Did they suffer with Meath volunteers being sucked into Dublin City during this period?
Oh, I'm afraid I can't give a good answer to that.
No problem.
I'm sorry.
No problem.
I can only make a general observation that compared with other counties, well, if you were to look at a league table of IRA membership, Meath would be in the second half of the table. Now, that said, they were capable of organizing themselves, but it was a leaky organization. But beyond that, I didn't make the IRA in Meath the object of my research as such. But I can certainly, if that chap wants to correspond with me by email, I can put him in the way of material that will answer his question.
100%. Because I remember as well, Michael Collins had actually mentioned that he found that the auxiliaries from around the Gormanstown area were particularly vicious. He actually feared them. It was around the time of Fernside. One question I wanted to ask you, maybe last question, I suppose. What motivated you to write the book?
Well, first of all, I live in Kilmessan, which is about 4 miles from Robinstown. And when I was reacquainting. I've always been interested in history, going back to when I was in school. And, you know, when the decade of centenaries started, I would have started reacquainting myself with the history of the period. And Oliver Coogan, who was a local historian, wrote a tremendous book about the War of Independence in Meath. And I read that, and I came across, that was the first time I came across reference to the Chandler business, the Robinstown business. And I suppose I was intrigued by the two aspects of it that I capture in my two key questions. What were the auxiliaries doing raiding a Protestant premises?
Yeah.
Because I, like so many other people, was inclined to make the equation of Protestantism and loyalism. And then the other question that I had in my mind and I wanted to get to the bottom of was, why did this affair become such a big deal? You know, I mean, nothing much happened, really.
Yeah.
I mean, it was for sure, it was traumatic for the family, without a doubt. But in the overall scheme of things, I mean, this was not it didn't really amount to a whole hill of beans. So that kind of spurred me to kind of do some digging. And then, you know, lockdown started this time last year, and I needed a couple of projects.
Absolutely, everyone does. Yeah,
it became a lockdown project, and it was fantastic. I mean, at times it was a lifeline.
Yeah, yeah. I have to say though, how you told that story was incredible. I'm certainly going to get this book, because I'll tell you one thing I find as well is that a lot of locally produced books are the kind of books that go out of date or out of publication after a while, and they're really important to get now. So it's available from Antonia's bookstore in Trim and from Alan Hanna's in Rathmines, and you can contact Jim at mail@jimoleary.ie, and his Facebook page is Meath in a Time of War. Jim, it's been an absolute privilege and honor to have you on. Thanks so much for this tonight.
No, I enjoyed it thoroughly. Thank you very much.
By the way, thank you. All the best. Take care.
All right. Bye.